Welcome back, everybody. Not just to another episode, but to episode 50, 50. Yes, we made it. And it could not have been possible without your support, without your help. All of the folks that have listened to the show over the past year, the folks that have paid attention, the folks that have given comments, the folks that have criticized, that have provided feedback. I'm learning, you're learning, we're on a journey together, and let's keep growing this hopeful majority. And if you're new to this, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we drop audio and video. The reason why we're building the show is because we believe that most people in the country want to have the conversation. Most people in the country want to listen to each other. They want to have dialogues, even if we're ideologically diverse and have really strong beliefs. We are temperamentally moderate, and that is the hopeful majority. So with that, we're going to have a very special episode during our 1 year anniversary, which is just coming up in a couple of weeks. But today we're going to have our solo episode. As you know, we've been alternating between interviews and solo episodes because a lot of folks are interested in the solo perspectives, given all of the work that I'm doing on colleges and high schools across the country. And also people are interested in the conversation. Today's episode, you might have seen, last week, New York Times released a poll that showed that President Trump was ahead of President Biden in almost, I think, in every swing state, actually, if I read it correctly. You can look it up. It's one of the most talked about polls currently in the media. But what stuck out to me, and this is going to be the subject of the episode, is actually an anecdote that a voter provided. Here's the anecdote. I'm not a party person. I'm more for the state. I can't stand Biden. I think he ought to be in prison. I also think Trump should be in prison. I hate being given those two choices. I hate being given those two choices. That is a sentiment that I've heard more and more and more. And specifically, they use the word hate. That's a powerful word. We live at this moment where we're staring down another election cycle where people feel extremely dissatisfied. So the question for the show is, how did we get here? With that, let's get into that monologue. How did we get here? How are we looking at a Trump-Biden rematch again in 2024 at a time where 85% of voters are dissatisfied with the system? The New York Times actually asked a secondary question set in addition to who people would vote for, which was, how much change do you think the system needs? And I think it was like over 50% of voters said that they want either radical change or at least significant change to the system, which is a huge statement. And the more and more I've been traveling, as you know, I put out an episode 2 episodes ago about what the real story on college campuses is, which if you haven't checked out, you should take a listen, where we specifically looked at what students are thinking. And I keep hearing the sentiment of people saying, I can't stand these two choices. I can't stand them. And so naturally the question becomes, well, how are we here? What caused it? Now, this is a very complex, I think, topic, and oftentimes in our media, pundits will sit here and tell you that I have the solution. This is this talking point, and nothing else is true. I don't think I have the definitive answer, but here's what I've learned, and here's what I've seen. I think broadly, our system has two components. I think democracy has two components. It's the institutions and the citizenry. The institutions, everything from churches to local civic centers to the Department of Justice to the Supreme Court to Congress. And then you got the citizenry, us, the people, and how we engage and how we act. I think at its core, those are the two big levers. And last episode, we actually had on Congressman Kilmer, who just did an entire honest, open, transparent conversation about how to fix the incentives that affect our institutions, things like gerrymandering, campaign finance reform, about how we elect our citizens and voters and politicians, ranked choice voting. There's a whole episode there. What I want to focus on is the citizenry aspect, because I think we, the people, the hopeful majority of people, I think are actually a big part of the solution. What do I mean by that? Well, how is it that we are at a point where we're facing down a rematch between two people that most Americans might not necessarily like or are favorable of, but feel like they're being forced to, and yet most Americans also express that they just do not want those two choices? How is there such a disparity between what the majority is thinking and what the reality is? It almost feels like we're living in a distortion. I want to share two numbers with you. Actually, one number, two examples. One number is 10. 10. In our primaries, in case anybody is curious about how the election system works in the United States, you have primaries and then general election. Candidates run in their party primary, they win, and then they have to fight the other candidate in the general election. 10% of voters vote in our primaries, which means that the candidates that are getting to the general election are a result of the voices of 10% of the electorate. And you know who that 10% of the electorate is. That's the most charged, passionate people. Those are the people that will believe in whatever they believe in to an absolute degree. Those people are what we often call the ideologically rigid groups of people. It's what I call the temperamental extremes. So 10% of people, the temperamental extremes, are dictating the reality of what happens in a general election for the rest of the 90% of us, what I call the hopeful majority of people. The second 10, now, this might vary depending on the social media platform, but when you survey most platforms, they'll say that about 10% of users generate 90% of the user generated content on social media. What does that mean? That means that of the 10 posts you read a day, 9 of those are created by 10% of the people on, let's say, X, or the people, let's say, on Instagram. So that means that 10% of users are controlling and dominating the narrative on our social media platforms. You get the theme here? Do we see what's happening? I think we're living in a moment where the reality is not defined by the majority of people. In fact, not even forget the majority. The reality is not being defined by those that want to listen, hear each other, are open to discussion, open to dialogues. The reality is defined by the 10% of the vocal extremes. That's how we got here, I think, on the citizenry side. I think we, the people that are actually listening to the show, the folks that care about dialogue, the folks that care about trying to solve our problems, the folks that have really strong beliefs. Again, this is not a question about ideology. I have really strong beliefs. You have really strong beliefs. We probably disagree. That's a great thing. The problem here is that the vocal extremes are not open to that disagreement. They're not open to listening to each other. And they're the ones that show up at the ballot box. They're the ones that control the narrative on social media. They are the ones, actually, 2 episodes ago, I talked about this, the missing story in our college campuses. If you've been tuning into the student protests, the 10%, the vocal extremes, they're the ones that are actually out there as outside agitators fueling the protests on campus, while the silent majority of students who just want to be normal functioning college students that want to go to class, want to listen, want to hear different ideas on the Israel-Palestine issue, that want to try to solve that problem, they're completely silent. So we are living at this moment where the vocal minority is controlling the narrative at the expense, sorry, let me back up, not the expense, at the cost and detriment of the silent majority of people. So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Part of the reason why I created the show 50 episodes ago, and part of the reason why we're building this together, part of the reason why I ask you every week to provide feedback, to give thoughts, to make guest suggestions, and you can do that at thehopefulmajority.com and submit contact form there. Part of the reason why we're working together on this is because I think that people like us, what I call the temperamentally moderate but ideologically diverse, again, this is not about ideology, it's about how we think, not what we think. We're just not vocal enough. You know, one of the folks that actually just released a TED Talk recently, someone that we've worked with a lot, he's a great thinker, Daniel Lebetsky, founded the Kind snack company, food brands. You might have seen their granola sacks. He often says the extremists, the vocal extremes, wake up in the morning thinking about how they're going to push their ideology, while the temperamental moderates like us wake up in the morning thinking about what we want to have for breakfast. I think that's absolutely true. I honestly never wanted to build the podcast. I love this podcast. I've learned so much from it. I want to keep doing it. I really appreciate the conversations, but my instinct was not, I want to be out there trying to rally and do my small piece in elevating the silent majority of people, because that's just not my temperament. What I love doing is building my organization with some amazing friends called Bridge USA, where we have college and high school chapters. I want to learn. I want to think. I want to read a bunch of different books. I don't necessarily feel extreme certainty about what I believe. I feel much more certainty about the process that I take to try to approach my beliefs. I'm curious. I try to question myself. I think a lot of you are probably similar. And so we're not getting up in the morning saying we got to show up to that primary, or we're not getting up in the morning saying we have to build a podcast to elevate our voice, or we're not getting up in the morning to say, well, I'm going to be on Twitter shaping the narrative. So how does this connect to the election? It's because President Trump, President Biden, our elected officials only hear from the vocal extremes. In fact, it's not just that they hear from them; their electoral outcomes are shaped by listening to the hopeful to the vocal extremes because their incentives are to speak to the people that vote. Their incentives are to speak to the people that are controlling the narrative on social media. And so, if the temperamentally extreme are controlling the narrative in social media, they're controlling the narrative at the ballot box, and they're controlling the microphone, who do you think is going to have a bigger weight of voice when the election's happening? And that's how we got here. That's how we got to a race between two people that most people are not interested in. Most people, as the voter on the front said, he said, again, I don't necessarily agree with this perspective, by the way, but this is what he said. And it ends with, I think, the sentiment that most of us agree with. I can't stand Biden. I think he ought to be in prison. I think Trump should be in prison as well. I hate being given those two choices. If that isn't a more accurate description of our politics right now, I don't know what it is. Maybe not the prison part, but at least the part where he says, I hate being given those two choices. The entire point of the show, the entire point of what we're building here is that it is up to us, the silent majority of people, that I think is actually the hopeful majority of people, to elevate and make our voices heard, not about necessarily an ideology, but to make our voices heard about the way in which we need to have the conversation in our country. We are in a process battle. We're in a process battle. It's between dialogue and destruction. It's between building and breaking. It's between cooperation and conflict. And the problem right now is the people on the side of conflict, destruction, and breaking are just much louder, much more engaged, partially because their temperament is what enables them to be that way. And it is up to us to shift that reality. I think the way that you start to disrupt the distortion reality that is our politics, where we're living in a moment where you have choices that people are not interested in, is I think for us to figure out how we change and elevate our voices. I'll give you a perfect example of this. I shared this 2 episodes ago with our college students. We hosted a call with our college students from USC, UT Austin, Stanford, Berkeley, Columbia, and one other university. I'm forgetting it for right now. There were this was at the peak of the protests, and they said something very peculiar. They said, Manu, it's not necessarily that we don't know how to have the dialogue and the conversation. It's that a lot of people on campus are just scared. The permission structure to have the conversation does not exist. The permission structure to have the conversation does not exist. Folks, we could build the best institutions. We could pass things like ranked choice voting that a lot of our allies talk about. We could focus on gerrymandering, campaign finance reform, etc. But the fact is that the second half of our democracy is people, the ones that show up to the ballot box, us, the people that are enshrined in the Constitution, those that have inalienable rights. If we are scared to have the conversation, if we are ceding the town hall to the vocal extremes, if we are choosing to be checked out at a moment where we need to be checked in, then what's going to happen is inevitable. It's the reality that we're seeing today. It is up to us. So we got here, in my perspective, by multiple causes of factors that reside on the institutional side. And we talked about that in the last episode. Congressman Derek Kilmer, who spent his career basically trying to fix Congress while he was in Congress. But the second part of this is our citizenry and how we show up. The dynamic. I don't think we're actually as polarized as we think we are. I think the majority of people share very similar convictions. I think the majority of people have very similar goals. We want to have a family. We want to try to set up a world in which our kids do better than ourselves. We want to be safe in our neighborhoods and societies. We want to work hard. We want to be able to provide without working ourselves to death. Not a big wish list. And yet, the vocal extremes would have us think that the 90% of us not only are incredibly divided, but should hate each other. And that is not true. Don't stake the future of our democracy. Don't stake the future of our country. And most importantly, don't stake your future on the outrage industrial complex that is dominated and dictated by a vocal extreme of people that believe that it's their way or the highway, when in fact, people like you and I have very strong beliefs, but we're open to hearing each other out. We're open to the conversation. We're open to the dialogue, and we have to show up. We have to vote. We have to dominate on social media, because if we don't, then our elected officials have to listen to the vocal extremes, because that's the incentive structure. So what do we do about it? We've got a whole nother year of amazing conversations, amazing episodes. I so appreciate you listening. All feedback is welcome. The Hopeful Majority, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content. If you're new to the show, welcome. If you're old to the show and you've been listening, I see you, I hear you, I get your text messages. Shout out Patrick. Thank you. Because we've got to build this hopeful majority one step at a time, one episode at a time, one like, subscribe, review, whatever you want to call it, because hey, that's how the vocal extremes win. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you on the next episode. Episode 50. We made it.